The Whippleby and District Horticultural Society's annual Dahlia and Chrysanthemum show was not, by reputation, a theatre of excitement. If a surprise occurred, it was usually of the variety that involved a decorative cactus turning out to be ineligible on account of the owner having bought it from a Wolverhampton garden centre only the week before. Nevertheless, this year's gathering was considered by many to be promising. The schedule included not only the usual classes for buttonholes and table arrangements, but also, for the first time, a novelty vegetable competition. Mr. Sidney Plumbull, who was treasurer, had spent much of the preceding fortnight circulating the phrase comic marrow with an air of expectation, as if comedy in vegetable form might restore the Society's dwindling membership. Mrs. Ethel Croom, who had not smiled since 1952, had entered a potato shaped like a teapot. It was, to her mind, more appropriate to the solemnity of the occasion than the rude carrot twins produced by her neighbour. The evening was proceeding as usual. The vicar had congratulated the committee on sustaining the horticultural spirit of the county, and several of the ladies had taken to whispering about Mrs. Blatherwick's display of chrysanthemums, which were suspiciously advanced for the season. Then, in the middle of the prize-giving, a sound was heard, not a cough or polite throat-clearing, but a noise more at home in the back row of a cheap melodrama. It was low, strained, and peculiarly deliberate. A whisper, though one oddly projected. Those near the hall's side door, which gave out onto a small yard, were certain it said, "It will be midnight." And then... The speaker, however, remained invisible. A hush followed. The vicar, unwilling to allow supernatural drama to usurp the Almighty, declared it must have been the draught. The more sceptical suggested one of the boys from the grammar school, though nobody could explain why a sixth-form prankster should choose horticulture as his stage. Mrs. Blatherwick fainted, Mr. Plumbull fumbled the prize envelopes, and Mrs. Croom, who had once been accused of sleeping through a church bazaar fire drill, announced loudly that someone was clearly about to be murdered. That remark set the tone for the remainder of the evening. By the time Inspector Purbright was notified, in the form of a telephone call from a nervous constable who had been instructed by 3 separate committee members to do something at once. The incident had been embroidered considerably. Accounts included a cloaked figure seen slipping away, a death rattle in the doorway, and in one excited version the words, "At midnight you die," allegedly whispered directly into Mrs. Blatherwick's ear. Purbright, accustomed to the hysteria that could be aroused in Flaxborough by the misplacement of a flower show raffle book, promised to attend in the morning for now. He made a note, market town hysteria, whisper, midnight threat, likely prank, possible more. Then he returned with characteristic patience to the evening's paperwork, chiefly a set of contradictory statements about the ownership of a bicycle abandoned outside the King's Arms. Tomorrow, however, he would begin to listen, and in Flaxborough, listening was often quite enough. By breakfast time the following morning, Flaxborough had already decided in its private capacity what to make of the Horticultural Hall whisper. At least, it had decided several things, no two of them alike. Mrs. Blatherwick, still a little wan from her faint, informed her milkman that a threatening male voice had positively hissed into her left ear, though she admitted she had seen no one. By the time the milkman passed the tale to his wife, the phantom had acquired a foreign accent. At the fishmonger's counter, half an hour later, the whisperer had become a bearded anarchist, likely escaped from the continent. Meanwhile, Mrs. Ethel Croom, who viewed life as an ever-expanding catalogue of menace, told her neighbour she had distinctly heard the word murder. She embroidered this after 2 cups of tea, with an additional claim that the whisper had been followed by a faint, metallic clink, like a dagger being sharpened. This detail was swiftly discounted by her neighbour, who pointed out that daggers, in her limited but authoritative understanding, were not generally sharpened in the wings of church halls. At the post office, speculation was given more practical form.
"If it's true about midnight," remarked Miss Annie Howcroft,
"Then someone in town had better mind where they are after dark." Miss Howcroft, who had never been out later than 10 o'clock in her life, permitted herself the satisfaction of prophesying doom for those whose morals allowed them to wander. In the snug of the King's Arms, the general opinion was that the whole matter arose from some daft bugger with cider inside him. Mr. Caleb Wheatley, the landlord, went further, suggesting that the whisper had probably been no more sinister than the draught under the side door, causing Mrs. Blatherwick's false teeth to rattle. The company laughed, not out of disbelief, but because it was so much more comforting than the alternative. By mid-morning, Inspector Purbright had been furnished with 5 different versions of the event. Constable Sidlove, who had been deputed to interview the committee members before breakfast, brought back a notebook filled with contradictions and circumstantial embroidery. "They're all certain it was a whisper." "Sir," Love reported, "but not one of them can agree what it said.
"Half think it was about murder, half about midnight. And Mrs. Plumble reckons it might have been somebody advertising a midnight sale at Hardy's Drapers." Purbright,
Seated at his desk with an expression of steady amusement, tapped his pencil against the blotter. An unfortunate form of marketing, if so, though one must admit it would attract attention, Love grinned. "Shall I check with Hardy's, sir?" "That won't be necessary, Constable. I should be inclined to think, in the absence of evidence to the contrary, that Hardy's would prefer to limit its commercial promotions to the columns of the Chronicle."
"Still," Purbright leaned back, steepling his fingers, "it will do us no harm to establish who was actually in that hall."
"And more particularly who was near the side door." The side door, it seemed, was the point upon which most witnesses agreed. It was generally accepted that the whisper had come from that direction, though no one could say whether the door had opened. The yard beyond, a bleak patch of cobblestones backed by the rear wall of the town library, had been empty when one of the committee rushed out to investigate, or at least empty of people. The only object of note was a discarded toffee paper. The whisper had left no footprints in the town's imagination. Instead, it had multiplied into conjectures. Purbright set out that morning to the Horticultural Hall, where Mr. Sidney Plumble, treasurer and general worrier, awaited with the air of a man guarding a crime scene of international consequence. "I must say,"
"Inspector," Plumble began at once, "this has cast a most unfortunate pall over what was,
until that moment, a very successful show. Subscriptions were up this year, you know. We had new entries in the tomato classes.
And then this outrage." Purbright looked around the hall.
The blooms, most of them already wilted from the warmth of the gas heaters, still stood in their vases, labelled with fading cards. A row of cucumbers, commendably straight, rested like small green soldiers awaiting inspection. Nothing in the quiet order of the exhibit suggested menace. "Perhaps you could show me," Purbright said gently, "exactly where the whisper was heard." Plumble led him to the side door and gestured, as though introducing a particularly recalcitrant guest. "Here, Inspector." Mrs. Blatherwick was sitting there, 3rd chair from the end. Mrs. Croom was opposite. "I was on the platform with the vicar, about to hand out the prize for the marrow section. Did you yourself hear the words?" "Well," Plumble hesitated, then brightened. "Not words exactly, more a sound."
Like a cat with a sore throat."
But the ladies were most insistent. Purbright examined the door. The catch was loose, the wood splintering slightly at the bottom where it scraped against the cobbles. He opened it, stood for a moment in the yard, and looked back into the hall. From here, anyone leaning close could have whispered without being seen. "Would the committee, perhaps, have enemies?" he asked mildly, returning inside. Plumble stiffened.
"Enemies, Inspector?"
"We are a horticultural society." "Yes," Purbright replied. "That is why I ask." The treasurer coughed, then admitted, "There was, I suppose, a certain disagreement with Mrs. Croom last spring, over the proper height of sweet peas permitted in the decorative class. She is, you know, inclined to interpret the rule-book with unnecessary
rigor. This, Purbright reflected, was less motive for murder than for mild rudeness.
Still, he made a note of it. He spent the rest of the morning speaking quietly with several witnesses. Their statements varied as wildly as Love's report had promised. Mrs. Blatherwick, pale but eager, repeated her tale of the whisper in her ear, adding that she had detected a faint odour of tobacco. Mrs. Croom insisted the voice had been menacingly cultured, perhaps that of a solicitor. Mr. Plumble, still unshaken from his cat analogy, remained committed to the theory of a sick feline. What none of them could explain was why such a whisper should be uttered at all, or why midnight should feature so prominently in half the accounts. Midnight in Flaxborough was not an hour associated with crime, but with indigestion and municipal silence. By noon, gossip had extended into the surrounding villages. A woman buying flour in Dibley insisted the police had uncovered a plot to murder the mayor. At the railway station buffet, a porter declared that a corpse had already been found. Purbright heard this later in the day from Sergeant Malley, who reported it with the weary tone of a man accustomed to tidying up the borough's imaginative excesses. "Shall we put a notice out, sir? To say it was just a prank?" Malley suggested. Purbright shook his head. "Let the town have its story for a day or two. Better to listen to what grows out of it. You may be surprised how often embellishment leads to accuracy, eventually." The sergeant looked unconvinced, but Purbright had already turned to his paperwork. He was sketching a rough plan of the hall, the side door marked in pencil, the chairs aligned. It was not, he thought, a great mystery yet. But sometimes, in the humdrum architecture of local life, a very small creak in a door frame could open upon quite an unexpected chamber. That evening, as the gas lamps were lit in the high street and the respectable inhabitants of Flaxborough settled to their suppers, several made certain to draw their curtains early. Midnight, after all, was only a few hours away, and while none expected violence to come knocking at their own door, it was generally agreed that something was afoot. At the King's Arms, the landlord noted with satisfaction that the snug was unusually crowded. Fear, it seemed, was good for business. Mrs. Croom sat upright at home, knitting with the brisk energy of one who might repel death itself by producing a surplus of dishcloths. Mrs. Blatherwick, fortified by brandy, declared she would stay awake until midnight to see what happened, and Purbright, in his office at the station, reviewed once more the conflicting tales, considering with patient curiosity what kind of mind would find amusement or purpose in whispering doom at a flower show. He did not, however, stay up for midnight. He suspected he would hear about it in the morning, if midnight had anything further to offer. When Flaxborough awoke the next morning to find that midnight had passed without calamity, there was both relief and a peculiar sort of disappointment. The town's appetite for drama had been whetted, and the absence of murder or even mild assault left an uncomfortable void in the day's conversations. Mrs. Blatherwick, who had bravely fortified herself with brandy and sat up until the clock on her mantel struck 12, insisted that she had heard the whisper again just as the hour chimed. "Clear as anything," she told her neighbour at the greengrocer's, "only fainter, and it seemed to drift across the street."
Something about keeping watch. The neighbour,
a practical woman who disliked nocturnal mysteries interfering with her purchase of runner beans, replied that perhaps it had been the paperboy turning in his sleep at the police station. Constable Sid Love arrived with his usual mixture of earnestness and perplexity. He had spent the early morning hours patrolling the square, half expecting to stumble across some scene of violence. All he had encountered, however, was the baker's boy unloading flour and a cat engaged in delicate negotiations with a fish head outside the market. "Nothing doing, sir?" Love reported, standing with cap in hand. "The only thing I heard at midnight was the clock striking." Though Mrs. Blatherwick swears blind, she heard another whisper.
I expect she means her own kettle rattling. Purbright, who was reviewing the statements once more, allowed himself a faint smile.
It would be difficult, Constable, to sustain a crime entirely out of noises half heard by persons fortified with brandy. Still, it is curious. Love leaned forward. Do you think it's a prank, sir? Purbright's pencil hovered over the page.
Perhaps.
Or perhaps not. A prank requires amusement, usually shared. There's little evidence of mirth in this affair. On the contrary, it seems to have spread unease. And unease, if carefully applied, can be quite useful to someone. The constable considered this gravely, as though it were a matter of horticultural policy. Then, brightening, he added, "If it were a prank, though, sir, it's a queer place to do it."
A flower show, precisely, Purbright murmured.
Queer enough to be worth thinking about. By mid-morning, the town's more excitable elements had begun to interpret the absence of bloodshed as a postponement rather than a reprieve. "Not last night, perhaps," said Miss Annie Howcroft at the post-office counter. "But it'll be soon, you mark my words." She said this with such relish that her companion had to remind her not to drip sealing wax onto the stamps. At the King's Arms, the snug was quieter than the night before, but still sufficiently animated to keep Mr. Wheatley in trade. The consensus there was that the police were keeping something back. "You don't have whispers like that unless there's summit behind them," declared Mr. Dobson, whose knowledge of criminal psychology was based on many hours of listening to the Home Service. "Mark my words, there's a body in it somewhere."
Only they've hidden it. Purbright, meanwhile,
resolved to continue his inquiries in the way he found most reliable, by listening to the people of the town at their own pace, letting their contradictions and half-truths expose the shape of something more solid. His first call was upon Mrs. Blatherwick herself, whose recovery from faintness had been so rapid as to leave the impression of opportunism. She received him in her front parlour, a room that smelled faintly of mothballs and sherry. Her account of the evening was lengthy, embroidered, and punctuated by suspicious glances at the inspector,
as though she expected him at any moment to declare that she had been the intended victim. It was in my ear.
"Inspector," she repeated for the third time. I could feel the breath of it.
Very sinister.
I've no doubt at all it was a warning meant for me. My chrysanthemums, you see, were in line for the silver cup.
And Mrs. Croom is not above, well,
here she allowed the pause to suggest a multitude of horticultural malpractices. Purbright listened politely, but his questions were gentle diversions. Had she noticed anyone leaving their seat at the relevant moment? Had there been any creak of the door? Any unusual smell?
Yes, Inspector, she said eagerly. Tobacco. Strong foreign tobacco. None of your woodbines.
Quite coarse, this detail Purbright noted carefully. Tobacco had a way of being both commonplace and distinctive, and people were curiously exact about the smells they claimed to detect. From Mrs. Blatherwick, he proceeded to Mrs. Croom, who received him with an air of suspicion that suggested she felt herself under investigation. She was less inclined to faintness, more inclined to righteousness. The voice was cultivated, Inspector, she declared firmly. A gentleman's voice, though an evil gentleman. No doubt a man of the world, possibly a solicitor or a retired colonel. And he spoke of murder, quite distinctly.
I am prepared to swear it. And you are certain of the word?
Certain?
I should say so.
My hearing is unimpeachable.
I have never mistaken a syllable in my life.
Even the wireless announcers with their sloppy diction I correct aloud. Her certainty was such that Purbright allowed himself the faintest tightening of his lips, which in him amounted almost to a smile. He thanked her courteously and departed. As he walked back toward the station, Purbright considered the curious contrast between Blatherwick's whispered death sentence and Croom's gentlemanly assassin. Both ladies had been seated in positions that made hearing the whisper possible. Both were temperamentally inclined to dramatize, and both were sufficiently petty in rivalry to imagine the whisper directed at themselves. Yet their descriptions were at variance in every significant detail. Later that afternoon, Sergeant Malley entered with the news that a boy from the grammar school had been boasting of a prank at the flower show. "Says he and his mates thought it'd be funny to spook the old dears," Malley explained. "Whispered something through the door and ran." "And what exactly did he claim to have whispered?" Purbright asked. Malley consulted his notebook. "Nice marrows, apparently." The inspector raised his eyebrows. "A commendation, certainly, but not the kind that induces fainting. No, sir."
I thought it was a bit thin. Quite. Purbright placed the notebook aside.
"Nevertheless, see that his headmaster knows of it. Mischief is one thing, but even mischief can sometimes serve as a cloak for more deliberate acts." As evening fell, Flaxborough began again to speculate. Would the whisper return that night? Some set alarm clocks to wait, though more fell asleep before the hour struck. Mrs. Croom stayed awake with grim determination. Certain she was a target of dark design, Mrs. Blatherwick had fortified herself once more with brandy and, before nodding off, confided to her cat that the police were relying on her vigilance. Midnight passed in silence. But at 12:15, as Constable Love turned the corner by the library on his way back to the station, he stopped short.
A figure was just disappearing down the lane toward the river, its shape indistinct in the lamplight.
He called out, received no reply, and gave chase. By the time he reached the corner, the lane was empty. Only the faint smell of tobacco hung in the air. Love reported this breathlessly to Purbright, who listened without comment, merely nodding and returning to his notes. He added a small mark in the margin. Not prank. Tobacco again. Someone wishes to be heard, not seen. It was becoming clear that the whisper at the flower show had not been a solitary oddity. Someone in Flaxborough, for reasons as yet unknown, intended their midnight murmurings to spread unease. And unease, in a town such as this, was as potent a weapon as any blade. The morning after Constable Love's nocturnal pursuit of shadows dawned with a damp drizzle, the sort of weather that flattened chrysanthemums and discouraged enthusiasm for anything beyond porridge. Yet the whisper had acquired new force, for the constable's report, passed along in confidence to Sergeant Malley, had leaked with astonishing rapidity. By breakfast, half the town knew of a mysterious figure seen near the library at midnight, and by elevenses the other half had decided who it must have been. Mr. Sidney Plumble, recounting the story in the grocer's queue, favoured the explanation of a tramp. The place has been riddled with them since they shut that hostel up at Market Deeping. They wander, whisper things. Half of them foreign. His listeners nodded with the uneasy satisfaction of people who enjoy a culprit, so long as he belongs to some other category of society. At the hairdresser's, however, Miss Annie Howcroft was certain the culprit was no tramp, but Mr. Dobson's nephew, a lad she described as given to funny looks. By the time the tale reached Mrs. Croom, the mysterious figure had grown into a hulking brute with shoulders like a navvy, clearly bent on silencing her. She spent the remainder of the morning composing letters of complaint to the constabulary, the Horticultural Society, and the Home Secretary, Dr. Purbright. Meanwhile, sat at his desk, gently tapping a pencil against his blotter while Love, flushed with the importance of his nocturnal adventure, gave his account once again. The inspector let him talk himself into every detail, the glimpse of the figure in the lamplight, the length of the stride, the smell of tobacco. "You are certain it was a man?"
Purbright asked finally. "Well, certain enough, sir."
"The build of him?"
"And the walk? Quick, but not running." "I'd have said a man." "Did you notice the sound of shoes?"
"Boots?" Love frowned. "I thought so, sir, but the cobbles were wet. Could have been anything." Purbright made a small mark on his paper. "And you lost him at the River Lane?" "Yes, sir." "Vanished like smoke." The inspector considered this with the patient gravity that always made constables feel both reassured and faintly foolish. "You did well, Love. I am only sorry you were not closer. Still, even a shadow has its value. It tells us where the light is, love, unsure whether this was praise or philosophy, blushed and stood straighter. By late morning, Purbright had determined to visit the library, which shared its rear wall with the horticultural hall's yard. Miss Lucy Teatime, the librarian, received him with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "We had no disturbances, Inspector," she said crisply, "unless you consider Mr. Harbottle's snoring in the periodicals room a menace. As for mysterious figures, I see plenty of those among our readers. You might observe a man from behind a shelf and think him a fiend, only to discover he is consulting a railway timetable." "That is the nature of libraries," Purbright nodded gravely, appreciating the remark as both fact and metaphor. He asked if any doors or windows at the back had been left unlatched, but Miss Teatime assured him her staff checked each night. "We keep the place tighter than a bank vault. Books are more easily pilfered than money, in my opinion." Leaving the library, Purbright crossed the yard to the side door of the hall again, running his hand along the splintered frame. The whisperer, whoever he was, seemed to prefer this particular place. Why here? Why choose a venue where so many would hear, but none could see? It was more performance than threat, yet performance for what audience? Back at the station, Sergeant Malley had been collating statements from townsfolk who claimed to have noticed unusual things in the past few nights. One woman insisted she had heard a man coughing under her window at 2 in the morning, though she admitted it might have been her husband returning from the privy. A clerk swore he had seen a lantern bobbing by the riverbank. A milkman claimed his horse had shied for no reason at all. "Everybody's got a story now," Malley grumbled, handing over the list. "We'll have ghosts by tea time." Purbright read them with mild amusement. "The mine sergeant is an eager gardener. It will grow weeds where there is no soil." He paused, then added, "Still, among so many weeds, one sometimes finds a useful root." The useful root came sooner than expected. At 3 o'clock, the police station received a visit from Mr. Arthur Binns, the caretaker of the town hall. Binns was a lean grey man with a face as expressionless as an old ledger. He reported that the night before, shortly before midnight, he had been locking up when he saw a man loitering near the gas lamp by the library wall. "Tallish," he said, in a voice as dry as dust, hat pulled low.
Stood there with his back to me.
"Didn't move till I went inside. Did you see his face?"
Asked Purbright. "No, just the hat." And I smelt smoke.
"Not a cigarette. Pipe. Strong. Foreign leaf." The inspector leaned forward. "You are certain of that?" Binns nodded once. "My brother was in the Navy, used to bring back that Balkan stuff. Same smell?" This small detail struck Purbright as more telling than any of Mrs. Croom's embroidered fears. Tobacco again. Foreign tobacco, remembered independently by both Blatherwick and Binns. It was a clue with substance. When Binns had gone, Purbright sat for a long while, gazing thoughtfully at the plan of the hall and yard. The figure wished to be noticed but not recognized. He chose his time, midnight, for maximum theatricality, but his means were curiously understated. A whisper, a hint of menace and then disappearance. It was less a crime than a prologue. That evening, Purbright walked home slowly through the drizzle, pausing at the square where lamps shone on wet cobbles. He imagined the scene as love must have seen it, the figure moving away, tobacco's scent lingering in the damp air. Someone was staging unease deliberately. The inspector had known men who preferred the preliminaries of fear to the act itself. But in Flaxborough, fear was not play, it was social currency, spent in whispers over garden fences, passed like coins in the snug of the King's Arms. At 10 minutes past midnight, while most of the town slept, Mrs. Croom sat stiff-backed in her armchair waiting. The clock ticked, her knitting needles clicked.
Nothing came.
She permitted herself a grim smile of triumph, as though she had personally repelled the powers of darkness. Then, faint and fleeting, she thought she heard a murmur from the street. She hurried to the window but saw only the lamplight glistening on empty stones. By morning, She was convinced it had been a direct warning. "He's circling me," she told Miss Annie Howcroft. "A gentleman assassin? Inspector or no inspector?"
I shall have to keep watch. And keep watch she did.
But so quietly did Purbright. For the inspector was beginning to think that the whispers were not merely theatre, they were rehearsal. And rehearsal, in his experience, preceded performance. If Flaxborough had been unsettled by the first whisper at the flower show, and titillated by the rumours of midnight sightings, it was now, by the middle of the week, approaching that peculiar pitch of excitement only a small town could sustain when the promise of a scandal seemed to hover just out of reach. Everyone felt that something was happening, though no one could say exactly what. That was more than enough to keep the talk lively. The Flaxborough Chronicle, always eager to seize on community anxieties, provided they could be framed as respectable concerns, published a short piece on alleged disturbances in the vicinity of the Beacon Horticultural Hall. The article was careful to attribute its information to unnamed residents, yet managed to give the impression that the police were suppressing grave developments. "Voices at unseasonable hours," the subheading declared, with a final line noting that our readers are reminded of the necessity for vigilance. Inspector Purbright read the piece over breakfast with a faint tightening of the lips that, in a more demonstrative man, might have been a scowl. He did not dislike the Chronicle. He regarded it, in fact, as a more faithful barometer of the town's state of mind than many official reports. But he was aware that, once printed, speculation gained a solidity it did not deserve. It was no longer a whisper, it was news. Later that morning, Purbright walked to the high street where Mrs. Hallam, the tobacconist, ran her narrow shop with a severity that suggested she considered every purchase a moral failing. The inspector's interest, however, was not in her judgment but in her stock. "You carry imported leaf?" he asked mildly, examining the rows of tins behind the counter. Mrs. Hallam sniffed. "For my sins, yes. A handful of customers with peculiar tastes. I keep a little Balkan mixture, and some of that dark Turkish ribbon, but hardly anyone buys it now. People prefer their cigarettes cheap and cheerful. Would you happen to know who still prefers the stronger blends?" She pursed her lips. "Mr. Tudge, the watchmaker, takes a tin every month."
Always the same.
"And Councillor Perks, he affects the Turkish sort, though I can't say it flatters his breath. And once in a while Mr. Harbottle from the library, though I suspect he buys it less to smoke than to impress people with his erudition." Purbright nodded, filed the names away, and bought a small packet of pipe cleaners he did not need, in order to preserve the shopkeeper's sense of fair transaction. The day continued without incident until evening.
When Sergeant Malley appeared at the inspector's office with a report that introduced an entirely new dimension. "There's been a letter, sir."
"Arrived at the Chronicle this morning. Anonymous, of course." The editor sent a copy across. He placed the sheet on Purbright's desk. The note was short, written in large. "Blockish capitals. At midnight the town shall hear the truth. Do not mock the whispers. They foretell what cannot be stopped." Purbright studied the crude lettering in silence. The words had a self-conscious theatricality about them, as though the writer were aiming at melodrama but falling short through lack of talent. Still, the intent was clear. Unease was being nurtured deliberately. "Any chance it's just schoolboys, sir?" Malley ventured. "Unlikely," said Purbright. "Boys may whisper for amusement, but they do not generally write to newspapers about destiny. That requires either conviction or a craving for attention." Malley frowned. "Then we're looking for a crank, or someone who prefers to be thought one." Purbright laid the letter aside. "Did the Chronicle receive the original envelope?" "No, sir. It came by hand. Slipped under their door in the night." That detail struck the inspector as quietly important. Whoever wrote it had wanted the letter to appear mysterious, but had not trusted the post. That suggested local authorship and perhaps impatience. The following night, half the town remained awake. Curtains twitched, clocks were watched with uncommon intensity, and dogs were unsettled by their owner's nervousness. At the King's Arms, the snug stayed open until the hour, the company drinking and speculating in low tones, ready for calamity. At midnight, precisely, the town hall clock struck, each note carrying solemnly across the damp rooftops. Then, just as the last chime faded, there came another whisper. This time, not at the horticultural hall, but drifting through the alley by the drapers. A voice, low yet clear enough to be repeated by those who claimed to hear it, saying, "Soon, soon, the truth is midnight. By morning," the phrase had already mutated. Some swore it was "the truth is murder." Others claimed it was "the truth is tonight." Whatever the wording, the effect was the same. Flaxborough was convinced that an ominous revelation was pending. Purbright received reports from 3 separate quarters, each describing the whisper's location differently. He walked the alley himself, noting how the walls carried sound oddly, making a single murmur travel as if from several directions. It was a perfect stage for a disembodied voice. Back at the station, he considered the growing pattern. The whispers, the letter, the chosen hour, each pointed to a person who wished to be heard, but not identified.
Not an assassin striking swiftly, but an actor stretching out a drama.
And actors, Purbright knew, seldom staged plays without an audience prepared to pay. The question was, who was intended to pay and in what coin? That afternoon, Councillor Perks paid an unannounced visit to the station,
his bulk filling the doorway with offended self-importance. "This nonsense must be stopped."
"Inspector," he declared, puffing faintly from the climb up the steps. "Our town cannot be made a laughing-stock. I've already had 2 telegrams from acquaintances in other boroughs jesting about our midnight ghost. Do you intend to take action?" "We are making inquiries," Purbright replied mildly. "Inquiries?" Perks snorted. "What is required is firm action, patrols, arrests. Make an example of someone, anyone, and this whispering will end." "I dare say it would," said Purbright evenly. "Though it might also end with the wrong someone." Perks glared, but Purbright's polite calm was immovable. Eventually, the councillor departed in a cloud of indignation and Turkish tobacco smoke. The inspector noted the scent, not for the first time. By evening, the gossip had reached fever pitch. Mrs. Blatherwick insisted she had divined the whisper's purpose, a confession, surely, of some long-ago crime. Miss Howcroft declared she had been warned by the voice not to trust her butcher. Mrs. Croom knitted with a kind of ferocious vigilance, sure that the next whisper would identify her assailant by name. Purbright, listening to these interpretations without interruption, allowed the talk to wind itself into knots. When the time was right, he thought, the truth would untangle itself, if only because lies, like chrysanthemums out of season, eventually wilted. That night, as the town once again waited for midnight, Purbright did not. He retired at his usual hour, leaving Sergeant Malley and Constable Love to patrol the alleys. Midnight came, the clock struck, and silence held. It was at 10 minutes past. However, that Love, walking by the river, heard it again. A whisper, distinct and chilling in the damp air. Midnight brings the end. He swung his torch toward the sound, but the beam fell only on reeds stirring in the breeze. By morning, the phrase was on every lip in Flaxborough.
Something was building.
Something, Purbright reflected as he stirred sugar into his tea, that was no longer content to remain a whisper. Inspector Purbright sat in his office the following morning with a cup of tea cooling beside him, and the vague impression that Flaxborough, left to its own devices, might soon talk itself into a full-blown tragedy without any outside assistance. Rumour, he had long observed, possessed a sharper edge than most knives. Once drawn, it had the unfortunate tendency to cut indiscriminately. Sergeant Malley entered carrying a small notebook and the faint air of a man who wished his information were more impressive. "Report from last night, sir," he began.
Constable Love heard the voice by the river, as you know.
He swears he was no more than 20 yards off, but when he gave chase there was nothing, no footprints in the mud, no figure running off. Just reeds moving, and the whisper itself. Clear as a bell, sir. He's certain the words were, "Midnight brings the end." He says it wasn't an echo or trick of the ear. Too deliberate? Purbright tapped his fingers gently on the arm of his chair. And yet our ghost seems to have the most practical regard for footwear, not a trace left behind. That suggests care or planning. Malley hesitated. There's another matter. Mr. Tudge, the watchmaker, came to the station first thing. Claims he saw a man loitering near the Draper's Alley yesterday afternoon. Described him as tall, wearing a long coat and a scarf pulled high. Said he looked foreign. That convenient adjective, Purbright murmured. Did Mr. Tudge attempt to speak to him? No, sir. Just watched him until he walked away.
East, toward the river. Purbright gave a faint smile.
It seems our phantom has been promoted from a disembodied whisper to a mysterious stranger. At this rate, I suppose we shall shortly be told he carries a lantern and rattles chains. Despite his irony, Purbright felt the unease that grew when accounts, no matter how flimsy, began to accrue detail. Fear always preferred a face, however ill-defined. That afternoon he walked alone to the riverbank, where Love had reported hearing the whisper. The water moved sluggishly under a pale sky, its surface scattered with floating leaves. He paused by the reeds, examining the mud. Malley had been right. No prints, no disturbance. The ground was soft enough to hold the faintest impression, yet nothing. Only the breeze shifting the stems produced the faint rustle that in other circumstances might be mistaken for voices. He remained a while, listening, until he heard a discreet cough behind him. Turning, he found Councillor Perks once again, this time accompanied by Mr. Harbottle from the library, both men wearing the air of conspirators caught in the open. "Inspector," Perks began, with the manner of one determined to seize authority by sheer volume, "it is my firm belief that this charade has gone quite far enough. Good citizens are losing sleep.
Businesses are suffering.
My own wife refuses to step out after dusk. Something must be done." "I am endeavouring to do something, Councillor," Purbright replied pleasantly, "though as yet my opponent is a whisper rather than a man." "It is more than that," Harbottle interjected, his voice lower, more cautious. "I have been considering certain patterns, literary parallels, if you like. The phrasing of these messages, 'The truth is midnight,' 'Midnight brings the end,' they bear the marks of someone who has studied theatrical or even ritual forms.
I should not be surprised if we discover the hand of an amateur dramatist." Purbright regarded the librarian with a glint of interest. "Do you think so?"
You may be correct. The writing of anonymous threats often owes more to play acting than to intention. Still, one must never dismiss the possibility that behind the theatre lies a sharper purpose. Perks harumphed. Sharp purpose or no, I expect results. If our police cannot apprehend the culprit, I may have to propose a civilian watch. Committees, patrols, citizens taking matters into their own hands. An excellent way of ensuring the streets remain crowded with people certain they've seen the culprit, Purbright said mildly. But let us wait before calling up the militia. I suspect our phantom thrives best on the promise of an audience. Deny him the crowd, and he may find his stage less appealing. That evening, Purbright convened a quiet meeting at the station. Only Malley, Love, and a pair of constables were present. He spoke without notes, his tone even. Our whisperer is methodical. Each appearance builds upon the last. A letter, then a voice, then a phrase. We may anticipate another development, something to keep the town's interest engaged.
He wants to be noticed.
That gives us an advantage. We must watch not where he vanishes, but where he chooses to appear. The horticultural hall, the Draper's Alley, the riverbank, all public, all accessible. He wants people to believe he is everywhere and nowhere. That illusion is hardest to maintain under direct observation. So we shall observe. He assigned posts discreetly, ensuring the men knew to remain out of sight. They were not to chase shadows, but to watch for flesh and blood. When midnight came again, the town was restless but less expectant. Many residents had begun to weary of losing sleep for what might be no more than prankishness. Yet at the corner of Mill Lane, as the clock finished its last chime, a sound rose. Not a whisper this time, but a low moan, wavering and unnatural, that seemed to roll along the rooftops. Within minutes windows were thrown open, cries of alarm went up, and once again Flaxborough was awake. Constable Love, posted near the old granary, ran toward the sound but found only the echo of his own boots. Yet Purbright, stationed quietly in a doorway nearby, caught something more. The faintest flicker of movement on a rooftop.
A figure, stooped and quick, disappearing into the shadows. The inspector did not pursue.
Instead, he noted the direction, the timing, the angle of retreat. An actor again, but this time one who had shown himself, if only for an instant. By dawn, the town's imagination was feverish once more. Some swore they had heard a woman screaming. Others insisted it was the toll of a funeral bell.
Rumour galloped faster than fact, but Purbright allowed it to run.
He had glimpsed enough to be certain that their phantom was neither spirit nor echo. It was a man, or at least someone very human, armed with patience, skill, and a flair for the dramatic. He returned to the station, weary but composed, and began drafting a quiet list, not of suspects yet, but of possible players. Who in Flaxborough relished theatre, had a taste for melodrama, and was willing to risk the night for an audience? That, he suspected, would prove the more fruitful line of inquiry than all the whispers combined. And as the sun rose over the town, catching on the spire of the church and the still waters of the river, Purbright resolved that before the Phantom's next performance, the curtain would not rise quite as smoothly as its author intended. Flaxborough woke the morning after the moan with a shiver of satisfaction that was only partly disguised as alarm. Citizens who had slept through the night felt cheated. Those who had heard the sound declared themselves traumatized, but could scarcely conceal the relish with which they gave their accounts. By 9 o'clock, the King's Arms snug was a symposium of speculation. One man insisted the noise was produced by a dying cow. Another argued that it was a mechanical device, perhaps a gramophone hidden on a rooftop. A third leaned forward darkly and whispered that such sounds were made by the banshee. Purbright, meanwhile, received at the station a parade of amateur witnesses, each anxious to deliver revelations. He listened with a patience bordering on saintly, though his notes rarely extended beyond 2 or 3 words. Mrs. Croom declared the voice had cried her name distinctly. Miss Annie Howcroft swore it had quoted from the Psalms. A nervous young clerk reported that his landlady fainted at the sound and was convinced the end of days was upon them. It was not until mid-morning that something useful emerged. Constable Love, sent to canvass the street where the sound had first been heard, returned with information from a boy who had been returning late from an errand. The lad claimed to have seen a rope dangling from the roof of the old solicitor's office, as though someone had climbed down in a hurry. Purbright dispatched Malley to examine the building. The sergeant returned with a coil of hemp rope, damp from the night air, but undeniably real. It had been tied off to a drainpipe and hastily hauled up, snagging on a protruding brick. That, at least, was tangible. The inspector studied the rope thoughtfully. So our phantom requires a means of ascent and descent. That makes him not a ghost, but a climber.
One who enjoys the illusion of being everywhere at once, Malley frowned.
Not many about town who'd shin up a wall in the dark, sir. Takes nerve and strength, indeed. But it takes something more. Forethought. He selects his stage, secures his exits.
I dare say we might learn more if we discover where he secures his rehearsal rooms. The phrase amused Mally not at all.
But he dutifully set about compiling a list of buildings with accessible rooftops and unobtrusive approaches. That afternoon, Purbright paid a call on the vicar, Reverend Copeland, whose rectory lay near the square where the sound had been heard. The vicar, a mild man with a fondness for cucumber sandwiches, admitted he had been woken by the noise, but had persuaded himself it was merely a cat in distress. My wife, however, is convinced it was directed against the church, he confessed with a faintly guilty air. She feels it is a warning, an unholy sign. Purbright's glance took in the tidy study with its shelves of sermons, its well-polished brass lamp, and the row of parish magazines. Warnings, Reverend, are of little use unless someone receives them. Did you notice anyone in particular about the square these past evenings? The vicar hesitated. Well, there was young Mr. Plimpton. He has been lingering after choir practice, loitering at the gates.
Harmless fellow, I should think.
A taste for theatricals, they say. But I cannot imagine him involved in anything sinister. The inspector thanked him, but the name was entered carefully in his mind. Mr. Plimpton, son of the draper, was indeed known to have appeared in local amateur dramatics, and once, according to Mally, in a magician's outfit at a village fete. An unlikely villain, perhaps, but exactly the sort who might relish an audience's gasps. Later, over tea in his office, Purbright considered the strands. A whisper in the hall, a shadow at the library, a moan on the rooftops. Each more elaborate than the last, yet all lacking one thing: motive. A man might play tricks for amusement, but this one expended energy and risk. Why? While he pondered, a message arrived from Mrs. Croom. It was written on thick paper and filled with underlinings. She demanded immediate police protection, having received a note pushed under her door that morning. The message, in a scrawl that trembled with intent, read, "At midnight you shall know." Purbright examined it with careful neutrality. The handwriting was clumsy but disguised, the ink ordinary, yet the act of delivering it suggested escalation. The Phantom's Theatre was moving from public to private, from crowd to individual. That narrowed his audience considerably. He visited Mrs. Croom that evening. She received him in her drawing room, the curtains drawn tight though the sun was not yet set. "It is persecution, Inspector," she declared, clutching the note. "He has marked me out. Perhaps it is because of my vigilance. The evildoer fears exposure." Purbright's tone was soothing. "Or perhaps, madam, he seeks merely to ensure the greatest circulation of his work. A message addressed to you is certain to be repeated by the whole town by breakfast." She bristled, but could not deny it. "Tell me," he continued, "did you hear the sound last night?" "Of course. It was directed at me. It said, 'Beware, woman.'" Purbright inclined his head politely, though he knew the phrase bore no resemblance to love's recollection. As he left her house, he reflected that the Phantom had chosen well. To plant fear in Mrs. Croom was to plant it in every teapot and sewing circle within the borough. That night, Purbright himself took a position in the square with Mally, watching the rooftops. The air was cold, the cobbles slick with mist. Midnight approached with a silence that pressed on the ears.
And then nothing.
The bells struck 12, the mist thickened, and the square remained undisturbed. But just as Purbright began to think their quarry had withheld his performance, a figure moved in the shadows of the churchyard wall. Quick, stooped, purposeful. Mally started forward, but Purbright stayed him with a hand. The figure paused, bent to place something on the ground, then slipped away into the fog. When they approached, they found a small, battered leather case. Inside, neatly coiled, lay another length of rope and a crude mask fashioned from black cloth with holes cut for eyes. Purbright examined it without expression. A prop sergeant, or perhaps a gift to his audience. Either way, our Phantom grows bolder. He means us to know he exists, yet still not who he is. We are not dealing with a prank alone. This is theatre with a plot. He closed the case and straightened. "And every play," he murmured, "demands its climax." The battered leather case with its rope and crude mask lay on Purbright's desk like an unwanted guest at tea. Mally hovered nearby, his broad shoulders filling the small office space,
as though he expected the thing to spring open and reveal further monstrosities. "It's a confession, sir," Mally said with certainty.
"Leaving it there like that. He's taunting us. Wants us to know he's watching." Purbright steepled his fingers, gazing not at the case but at the far wall. A confession, Sergeant, is usually an attempt to absolve. This feels more like a program handed out before the performance. "We are told what we might expect, but not the story itself," Mally's brow furrowed. "Well, if he's planning a performance, sir, I hope it doesn't have a body in the final act." "So do I." Purbright's tone was dry, but his eyes lingered on the mask. Its holes had been cut with clumsy scissors, the cloth frayed at the edges, the sort of work done in haste or perhaps deliberately roughened to heighten its menace.
"Theatricality again, Sergeant. Amateur theatre at that?" The sergeant brightened. "Plimpton, Purbright neither confirmed nor dismissed."
"Possibly, or anyone who thinks themselves capable of drama. We must not give the part to a player too early." The day brought no fewer than 5 visitors to the station, demanding to know whether the town was in peril. Councillor Perks was among them, producing an indignant letter signed by a number of shopkeepers urging stronger measures. "This business is affecting trade, Inspector."
"People are frightened to be abroad after dark."
"I sold 24 candles this morning to customers who would never normally indulge in such extravagance. I shall bear the matter closely in mind." "Councillor," Purbright replied with polite calm, "though I cannot promise to arrest the first man seen in a hat." Perks looked injured, but left, muttering about incompetence. By afternoon, a quiet lull settled in. Purbright used it to walk through the market square, listening to fragments of conversation that reached him like fluttering scraps of paper. 2 women at the greengrocer's. "I heard it was a prisoner escaped." A man outside the tobacconist's. "Mark my words."
It's them spiritualists again. And always
Woven into each account, the name of Mrs. Croom, sometimes pitied, more often mocked for her relish in playing the heroine of calamity. At the library, Miss Teatime cornered him with brisk authority.
"Inspector, this nonsense cannot continue."
Books are being returned late. Our regular readers complain of indigestion brought on by nerves. Last night I discovered a copy of Tennyson left on the steps as though abandoned in terror. "I should think Tennyson would withstand it," Purbright said. She regarded him severely. "The point is, fear unsettles people's habits, and that is dangerous." The remark stayed with him longer than he expected. Habits were the furniture of life in Flaxborough. To upset them was indeed dangerous. And someone, he felt sure, was counting on exactly that. That night, under a mist that hung like gauze, Purbright walked once more near the churchyard. He had no expectation that their phantom would repeat himself. Repetition was not his method. Still, it was better to be present than absent. The constables were stationed discreetly again, and Love, keen as a terrier, waited in the shadows near Mill Lane. The hours crept toward midnight. A silence thickened. Then, as the bells struck, a faint sound floated, not a whisper or a moan, but a scrape, metal against stone, from the churchyard itself. Purbright and Mally moved swiftly but without haste, slipping among the headstones. In the dim light they saw nothing, yet the scrape came again, louder now, like a shovel against earth.
Love, unable to restrain himself, darted forward with a shout. The sound ceased at once.
By the time they reached the place, there was no one. Only a freshly turned patch of soil beside a grave, and an object half buried there, a wooden cross, roughly made, with the words "Midnight Claims" scrawled across it in chalk. Love's voice shook. "He was digging, sir."
"Must have been."
"Digging up the dead?" Purbright examined the disturbed soil with calm detachment. "Or merely giving the impression?"
"Observe the turf has been cut, not removed." a gesture, not a task.
No grave robber would bother with chalk inscriptions, but why leave it? Mally demanded, for the same reason actors leave their props behind, to make sure the audience knows what the play is about. They carried the cross back to the station. By morning the news had spread, embroidered with every possible horror. Some swore the Whisperer was a ghoul risen from the earth.
Others insisted the graves themselves were moving.
The undertaker was besieged with questions, and church attendance doubled, not from piety but apprehension. Purbright, sipping tea while the town buzzed, knew the moment had come to begin narrowing the field. This was not random mischief. Each incident bore the mark of someone who planned carefully, sought maximum attention, and possessed a peculiar relish for dread without yet committing an actual crime. But why? He thought again of the rope and mask, of the moan of the chalked words.
Amateur theatre, yes.
But also a rhythm escalation crescendo. Their phantom was writing a story, piece by piece. And in stories, midnight was never the conclusion, but the turning point. The inspector folded his hands, eyes half closed. Somewhere in Flaxborough, someone was preparing Act 2. And when the curtain rose again, Purbright intended to be seated in the front row. By the following morning, Flaxborough was a town half enchanted, half afflicted. The wooden cross, chalked with its melodramatic threat, had seeded more speculation than even the boldest counsellor could keep pace with. In the cafes, every teaspoon clinked against porcelain as though punctuation to whispers. In the drapery shops, bolts of cloth were measured and cut beneath a drizzle of conjecture. Even the milkman reported customers waiting at their doors earlier than usual. Eager for news before breakfast, Inspector Purbright, having dealt with a pile of contradictory statements delivered by people who had either seen, heard, or dreamt the grave-digging spectre, took himself to the churchyard again in the pallid daylight. Mally trudged behind him, clutching a notebook already thick with accounts. The disturbed patch of soil looked unremarkable now, less sinister by morning, but the cut turf and chalk smudges on the cross were confirmation enough that the scene had been staged. "What strikes me, Sergeant," Purbright said, tapping the edge of his shoe against the turf, "is not so much that our phantom imitates grave-digging, but that he advertises it. Chalked proclamations, rope, masks, he is determined we should know his every gesture. Rather like a conjurer who makes sure to wave his hands before pulling out the rabbit." Mally frowned. "Conjurers at least give you a rabbit at the end, sir. This fellow seems content with shadows." "Precisely. He thrives on audience expectation. No conclusion, only performance. But eventually an audience grows restless." They left the graveyard and were immediately intercepted by Mrs. Croom, who had installed herself upon a bench with the clear purpose of witnessing any official inspection. She raised a gloved hand in solemn greeting. "I warned you, Inspector," she said in sepulchral tones. "It is a warning from the beyond. The chalk cross, why, it's practically scripture."
Midnight claims, yes indeed.
"The last trump is rehearsing." Purbright inclined his head. "And if you happen to see Gabriel polishing his trumpet, madam, do please let us know." Her scandalized gasp followed them halfway down the lane. At the station, Purbright asked for the small collection of theatrical pamphlets and posters confiscated months ago in an unrelated nuisance case. He spread them across his desk, considering the bold fonts, exaggerated masks, and Gothic flourishes. The resemblance to their phantom's props was undeniable. Crude, but derivative of this stock language of melodrama, he noted a particular pamphlet advertising a one-act morality play performed years ago at the town hall, The Claim at Midnight. The coincidence of title could not be overlooked. He summoned Mally. This pamphlet was distributed by the Amateur Dramatic Fellowship. Who chaired them? "Mr. Plimpton, sir." "Still does." "He's treasurer as well?" "Ah, the industrious Mr. Plimpton." Purbright leaned back. "We must, of course, be cautious. An enthusiast for stage melodrama is not automatically a nocturnal whisperer. But if anyone had both the inclination and the theatrical vocabulary, it would be he." By late afternoon, Purbright paid a visit to Plimpton's premises, an emporium of stationery, musical scores and bric-a-brac that overflowed into the street. The man himself emerged from behind a tower of cardboard boxes, wiping his hands on an ink-stained apron. He was all geniality, though his eyes glittered with a quick, watchful intelligence. "Inspector, what an honor! You're not in search of autograph albums again, or perhaps a program from our last recital?" "Neither, Mr. Plimpton. I am more interested in your society's repertoire. You once produced a piece entitled The Claim at Midnight." Plimpton chuckled, a sound both jovial and oddly strained.
"Oh, a trifle. Years ago.
"Hardly a masterpiece."
A moral drama, you understand. Villainous suitor, innocent maiden, justice arriving with the chimes."
"That sort of thing."
"Why do you ask?"
Purbright studied him levelly. "Because, Mr. Plimpton, someone in this town seems determined to restage it in the churchyard." For a fraction of a second, Plimpton's expression froze, then melted again into hearty disbelief. "Good gracious!
How macabre."
But surely you don't imagine—" "Oh no, Inspector. I have retired from such frivolities. My committee barely musters a quorum these days. We restrict ourselves to recitations and the occasional patriotic chorus." His words were smooth, but Purbright noted the nervous flutter of fingers against his apron. "Nevertheless," Purbright said gently, "should you think of anyone, perhaps an overzealous former member, who might be inclined to interpret midnight theatricals in such fashion, I should be grateful." Plimpton promised to consider, though his eagerness to close the conversation was plain. As Purbright walked back through the square, he reflected that Plimpton was certainly capable of pageantry, but whether he possessed the necessary stamina to wander graveyards at midnight was another matter. Still, the connection between the chalked cross and that old morality play was a chord too taut to ignore. That evening, the inspector convened Mally and young Love in his office. "Gentlemen, we must assume another act is imminent. He has announced his theme.
He will not resist delivering the sequel.
Therefore, our task is to anticipate his stage." Love suggested the canal towpath, recalling the moans heard weeks before. Mally favoured the railway yard, pointing out its abundance of shadows and echoing noises. Purbright listened, then shook his head. He chooses places of symbolism: the churchyard, the clock tower, the square. Settings that carry resonance. If he wishes to elevate dread, he will pick a site where superstition already lingers. Where, in Flaxborough, do whispers already dwell? After a pause, Mally said quietly, "The old gibbet field, sir."
Out by Whipple Lane, folks still cross themselves when they pass it. Purbright's eyes lit faintly.
"Yes, that will serve him well." They made arrangements discreet but thorough. Constables would be stationed in cottages nearby with a direct view of the field. Love was instructed in no uncertain terms not to spring out prematurely as he had at the churchyard. Mally, grimly determined, packed a flask and thick coat. The night was cool and damp, with a mist that crept low across the ground. They waited. Hours passed. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked.
An owl called.
Then faintly, a sound, a cartwheel squeaking, though no cart could be seen. Slowly, from the whiteness of the mist, a figure emerged, hooded, dragging a length of chain that rattled against the stones. Love's knuckles whitened on his truncheon. Mally muttered, "By God, sir, he looks like he's stepped straight out of the parish gallows register." But Purbright remained very still. He had seen the slight hesitation in the man's step, the conscious flourish with which the chain was swung. A performer gauging effect. The figure paused in the centre of the field. Then, raising an arm, he pointed directly toward the constable's hiding place, as though aware of their presence all along. A chilling laugh rang out, rehearsed, theatrical. And then, before anyone could advance, he melted back into the mist. When the constables gave chase, they found only trampled grass and the chain abandoned in the dew. Purbright bent to examine it. Not iron, as it had seemed, but tin links painted black. He straightened, the faintest sigh escaping him. Our phantom grows bolder.
He knows we are here and makes us part of his spectacle.
The performance is no longer for the townsfolk alone, gentlemen. It is for us. And as the mist closed round them again, Purbright knew the climax of the drama was drawing nearer. The phantom was no longer content with shadows. The next act, he felt certain, would not end without flesh and blood consequences. The mist had scarcely cleared from the gibbet field when Purbright found himself once more burdened with the town's hunger for explanation. By morning, the tale had already swollen into something grotesque. Housewives whispered that the figure carried the chains of executed felons. Schoolboys embroidered the story with red lanterns and severed hands. The tobacconist confided to his best customer that he had heard the very cart creak past his window. Flaxborough, starved of true excitements, was feeding greedily upon this morsel of theatre. Purbright did not trouble to contradict them. What disturbed him more than the citizens' imaginings was the figure's calculated defiance, pointing toward the constables as though the whole force were nothing but another part of his audience. It was arrogance, yes, but also a challenge. He was no longer content with shadows. He had invited pursuit. The chain, now resting on Purbright's desk, mocked him with its cheap paint and clumsy soldering. A prop, not a relic. Malley had taken one look and muttered that the fellow might as well have carried papier-mâché skulls. Yet Purbright knew the power of symbols lay not in their substance but in their presentation. A painted chain in fog could terrify as effectively as any gallows rope. Malley arrived, damp with the rain that had started just before dawn. He dropped heavily into a chair.
"What we combed the hedgerows, sir."
"Found nothing but rabbit holes. He slipped us like smoke." "Smoke with a timetable," Purbright murmured. He tapped the chain thoughtfully. "Every appearance has occurred in rhythm. The square, the tower, the graveyard, now the field."
A steady escalation of melodrama.
Each act larger, more audacious. He is rehearsing toward something. Love entered then, flushed with eagerness and shame in equal part.
"I ought to have run faster, sir. If I'd gone straight at him, you would have tripped over the chain and given him an encore, constable," Purbright interrupted gently.
No, his object was not to be caught, but to be witnessed. We must ask why. Love hesitated.
"To frighten the town, sir?"
Fright alone grows stale. Fear must be refreshed by climax. Our phantom knows this. He has reached the point at which mere apparitions will not suffice. He must deliver a finale worthy of his prologue, Malley groaned. "And where do you suppose he means to stage that, sir?" Purbright rose and crossed to the map pinned against the wall. His finger hovered over the town's modest sprawl. "Where all eyes may gather, where the echo of centuries lends weight. A place as public as the marketplace, yet steeped in resonance. He will want spectators, not just victims." His hand settled on the cathedral-like church at the town's centre. Here, he will not resist the church. That evening, the inspector sought counsel from Reverend Laxby, a nervous cleric with the look of a man forever bracing for thunderbolts. Laxby listened in stricken silence as Purbright explained. "You mean," the vicar stammered, "that this dreadful creature intends to profane the very house of God, with his chalkings and chains?"
"It is monstrous."
"It is theatre," Purbright corrected quietly. "But theatre can be monstrous in effect. I would advise discretion. Keep your vergers alert but silent. We shall station men within the porch and gallery. Should our phantom appear, he will find an audience he did not anticipate." Laxby wrung his hands, but agreed. As the hour approached, Purbright took his place in the shadowed nave. The church smelled of wax and stone. The great clock in the tower ticked with solemn patience. Malley crouched by the north aisle, Love fidgeted near the organ loft, and 3 constables kept still as gargoyles by the entrance. Outside, the town slept, unaware of the quiet watch being kept in its name. Midnight crept near. The only sound was the flutter of a bat in the rafters. Then, very faint yet clear, a creak of hinges.
A side door opened. A figure glided into the gloom, robed and hooded, bearing in one hand a lantern covered with crimson cloth.
The red glow painted the pillars and cast long shadows across the pews. The phantom advanced, chainless this time, but holding aloft a wooden cross daubed in white. He halted at the chancel and turned, as though addressing a congregation. His voice rang through the stone vaults. The claim is made.
At midnight the debt shall be collected.
Love started forward, but Purbright raised a hand. The figure went on, declaiming in a tone more suited to a provincial stage than a house of worship. Who shall deny the reckoning? Who dares dispute the claim? His words echoed, dramatic, absurd, and yet undeniably compelling. Even Mally felt the prickling of his skin. Then Purbright stepped from the shadows. His voice, calm and dry, cut through the theatrics. I should be inclined to dispute it, if only for want of a properly stamped receipt. The figure jolted, lantern trembling. For the first time the performance faltered. Who interrupts? The phantom demanded, his pitch rising. The local constabulary, Purbright said. You may consider this your curtain call. At his signal, constables closed in from every side. The figure made a desperate dash for the vestry, but Mally lunged and caught at the robe. It tore away in his hands, revealing not a spectre, but a sweating, ordinary man, Mr. Plimpton, treasurer and impresario of the Amateur Dramatic Fellowship. There was a gasp, more of weariness than astonishment. Plimpton struggled, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. "You fools!"
he shouted. "You've ruined it. Do you not understand? It was art, a drama to shake the town from its dullness."
Purbright regarded him with a mixture of pity and quiet triumph. You have certainly shaken it, Mr. Plimpton. But I fear the law does not look kindly upon such diversions, particularly when they involve trespass, threats, and graveyard vandalism. Plimpton sagged, defeated. They never came to our plays, never. Year after year, empty seats.
I gave them spectacle, better than they deserved, and they lapped it up.
You saw how they whispered, how they trembled. At last, they were alive. Alive, Purbright said gravely, until someone decided to copy your theatrics with something less harmless than chalk and chains, and then your art would have delivered not life but death. The lantern guttered and died. Plimpton, still panting, was led away. In the silence that followed, Purbright felt a sombre weight. For though the phantom was unmasked, the hunger he had fed, the town's appetite for dread, its glee in whispered terror, was not so easily extinguished. Flaxborough had tasted excitement, and whether from stagecraft or crime, it would surely crave more. As he left the church, the inspector looked back once. The red glow had faded, the shadows were merely shadows again. Yet he knew the performance was not over. The curtain had fallen on one man's theatrics, but the drama of Flaxborough was far from its final act. The morning after Plimpton's unmasking dawned with an anticlimax that only Flaxborough could have contrived. The Chronicle ran a headline of rare boldness: "Phantom is play actor." But by noon the town's collective appetite for horror had turned to irritation. Shopkeepers felt cheated of genuine peril. Old ladies, who had rehearsed their recollections of spectral moans for admiring grandchildren, discovered their stories now sounded faintly ridiculous. Mrs. Croom, most injured of all, declared to anyone who would listen that she had risked her very nerves for the sake of the community, only to be told it was nothing but Mr. Plimpton in a sheet. Purbright listened to this chorus with quiet patience. He had no intention of defending Plimpton's antics, but neither did he wholly accept that the matter was closed. His own mind was unsettled, troubled by an unease that persisted like a faint draught in a sealed room. Theatrical, though Plimpton's performances had been, too many details had pressed against them awkwardly, as if stitched to a garment that did not quite fit. The chain, the graveyard inscriptions, the digging sounds, these bore the impress of a man intoxicated by his own spectacle. Yet the case still smelled faintly of something harsher than amateur dramatics. Plimpton, in the cells, was unrepentant. "It was art," he repeated to Mally's questions, his thin face mottled with anger. "You police have no sense of imagination. The public needed awakening, and I provided it. Nothing more." Mally reported this with disgust. "Thinks he's some sort of visionary, sir. Wants applause instead of a charge sheet." "Visionary or not," Purbright said, "he shall have both." But even as the paperwork began, events turned awkward.
A farmer arrived at the station, his boots clotted with earth,
To report finding something unusual near the gibbet field. Not a prop or a scribble this time, but a man's pocket watch, its chain broken, half buried where the phantom had stood. Purbright examined it carefully. The casing was dented, scratched, but still bore an inscription inside the lid. "To Arthur, with constancy, M." He asked the farmer if he knew the object. The man shook his head. Yet Purbright remembered vaguely but distinctly having heard of such a watch some months earlier when a labourer named Arthur Maybury had disappeared after a quarrel at a tavern. His absence had been explained away as desertion, a man seeking labour elsewhere, though some muttered he had gone under altogether. The watch was a problem. Plimpton could have dropped it deliberately as part of his stage properties, but why carry such an item? It was neither theatrical nor symbolic. It was personal, intimate, and connected to a man unaccounted for. That afternoon, Purbright walked with Mally to Maybury's former lodgings, a sour-smelling room above a tinsmith's. The landlady greeted them with the relish of one whose patience had finally been rewarded. "I always said something was amiss," she declared. "No man leaves good boots behind if he means to start fresh. He owed me 2 weeks' rent, and he'd had words, nasty words, with that fellow Plimpton, only nobody would listen then." "What words?" Purbright asked softly. "Over a woman, of course." "They all are. Mrs. Datchery, widow, lives near the station."
Maybury fancied her.
Plimpton fancied her purse. They quarrelled more than once. Purbright thanked her, though her relish in recounting the details required no encouragement. By the time they reached the station, Mally was frowning hard.
"You don't think, sir?"
"I think," Purbright said, "that Mr. Plimpton's drama may have grown from soil richer than mere boredom. Conceit alone would not account for a missing man's watch planted in the very ground of his spectacle, unless it was chance, which I never find reliable." They questioned Plimpton again, showing him the watch. For the first time his confidence faltered.
His eyes widened, his mouth opened, then closed.
Where did you get that?" "In the field you selected for your performance," Purbright replied evenly.
"It does not appear to belong to you." Plimpton hesitated, then attempted bluster.
"A prop, nothing more."
"I collect such things," but his tone betrayed him.
Mally pressed forward. "You quarrelled with Maybury, didn't you? And you were the last to see him near the station." Plimpton's pallor deepened. "He was drunk. He left."
"I never saw him again." The denial rang hollow.
Purbright watched quietly, then asked, "Tell me, Mr. Plimpton, when you moaned beneath the tower, when you chalked your crosses, when you played with ropes and chains, were you rehearsing or were you remembering?" The silence that followed was longer than any answer. Later that evening, Purbright returned to the churchyard alone. The soil where the cross had been planted still showed scars. Kneeling, he brushed away damp earth. Beneath it, half hidden by roots, lay the corner of a cloth, stiff, dark, and smelling faintly metallic. He drew it out carefully. It was a man's coat, stained in a way no rain or mud could account for. Back at the station, under the gaslight, the truth emerged in every ugly thread. The coat was Maybury's. The stain was blood. Plimpton's theatrics had been no mere bid for attention. They had been a cover, a distraction, a grotesque way of weaving his guilt into entertainment. He had murdered Maybury in anger or desperation,
hidden the body and then, seized by some lunatic vanity,
transformed his crime into performance, mocking the town, daring discovery, dressing his conscience in costumes. When confronted with the coat, Plimpton broke. The words tumbled from him in sobs and shrieks. Maybury had taunted him, mocked his failure with Mrs. Datchery, threatened to expose debts and dishonesty in the dramatic fellowship's accounts. In rage, Plimpton had struck him down in the field. Panic, then a sudden inspiration. If the town would not come to his plays, he would turn his crime into one. Malley looked sickened, but Purbright only sighed. Art does imitate life, Sergeant, though in this instance life might have preferred the omission. The trial would come later, the details recounted with far less theatre. For now, Flaxborough returned to its uneasy calm. The gossipers shifted their tales once more, some insisting they had always suspected murder, others professing shock that such a meek man as Plimpton could harbour
violence. Mrs. Croom declared that she had known from their
first moan beneath the tower that something truly dreadful lurked behind. Purbright wrote his report without flourish. The rope, the mask, the chalk, the lantern, all logged. The coat sealed, the watch marked.
A life extinguished, another ruined.
And the town, restless, hungry for the next whisper. At dusk he stood by his office window, watching the lamps flicker along the square. Flaxborough looked the same as ever, respectable, drowsy, decorous. Yet beneath the curtains and cobbles he knew, small vanities and grudges lay waiting, each capable of blooming into mischief or worse. His task, patient and unending, was simply to notice when the bloom began. He returned to his desk, lifted his pen and began again the endless paperwork.